Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Executive Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
A horrific scene really unfolded in New Orleans just a few hours after New Year's Eve celebrations kicked off. A man rammed his truck into a crowd on Bourbon Street, killing at least 14 people and injuring over 30 people in what is being called an act of terrorism. The truck the suspect used to carry out the attack was found with IEDs, weapons, and an ISIS flag. When you see all of these emerging details, what sticks out to you?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that the war on terror was declared to be over, some maybe 6 or even 10 years ago. It was premature. The threat posed by Sunni jihadism, as we would call it, Sunnis making up roughly 80% of the Muslim world, it hasn't gone away. And so whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, the threat persists, the ideology remains. Thankfully, it's still a very small minority interpretation of the faith, but it is still significant. And we know that ISIS still exists in pockets of the Middle East and in Africa. We know the same about Al-Qaeda. And now, in fact, we've seen an Al-Qaeda group take over an entire country. We're talking about Syria. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham just conquered Syria from the Assad regime. So what we're looking at really is the fact that this has not gone away. There will be states run by jihadis. There will be cells operating in the United States or in Europe run by jihadis. This, of course, comes just after a Christmas market suffered a similar kind of an attack in Europe just about a week ago now. So this is a phenomenon I expect we're going to see more and more of this. It's hard to track, especially when these operatives are, that they're carrying out attacks in the form of cells as opposed to more formal structures. That means that this is an intelligence problem. And I suspect that right now we've got a lot of people at the FBI scrambling to figure out how many more possible cell members there may be, and of course looking for links to that exploding truck outside of a Trump facility in Las Vegas.
You're saying that the war on terror is still ongoing despite it being declared all but dead a few years back. Where exactly is ISIS the strongest, and who now is the leader of ISIS? Because as we know, back in October of 2019, al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was killed by the United States.
Yeah, I think that right now we're looking at more of a flat leadership structure, if you will. Same kind of thing is happening within Al-Qaeda, by the way. We had bin Laden and then Ayman al-Zawahiri as number 2. But you don't really hear about the new leaders of Al-Qaeda. You don't hear about the new leaders of ISIS. They're a bit more of an anonymous force right now. Perhaps they've been undergoing some kind of a new leadership structure. But I suspect that if we continue to see this kind of activity, whether it be in the form of lone wolves or in the form of, kind of secret cells that are animated here in the United States, as well as conquests of states and territory in the Middle East, I suspect we'll probably see some new figures emerge. I think there is a danger, though, and I think we've seen this over time of, beginning to think that, well, if we take out this one leader, well, then we will have solved the problem. And I think what we were able to show over the course of really the last 25 years is that even if you do take out some of these top leaders, you still have a problem. The movement's ideology continues to power this, and there will be new leaders that crop up in their place. So we're looking, again, this has always been viewed as a long war. It's going to go through peaks and valleys. I think we really did get, I don't want to say sidetracked because I think that's not fair, but I think that over the last 14 months since the attacks of October 7th and Iran waging a 7-front war in the Middle East, I think we all were sort of under the impression that the Sunni jihad problem of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that it kind of receded into the background, and that, Shiite Islam, radical Shiite Islam, more associated with the Iranian regime, that was the new threat. I think what we need to come to terms with right now is that both can be a threat at the same time, that the Middle East is still a problematic area with ideological challenges that we have yet to solve. And that's, of course, happening while we're also looking at, a war in Ukraine, an aggressive China. There are a lot of fronts that we're going to need to tackle. The new administration coming in on January 20th, the Trump administration, is going to have to deal with, I think, a much more challenging landscape than it had dealt with as compared to the previous administration.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what you're saying, it sounds like you're describing almost a whack-a-mole type scenario where you kill one leader of ISIS, but that doesn't really get rid of the problem. Instead, someone else crops up somewhere else. So what is the current state of ISIS as you and I sit here right now?
The current state of ISIS is that, you have individual pockets of either territory or structures that exist really throughout the Middle East and in Africa. You've got ISIS individuals that have sought shelter in places like Taliban-run Afghanistan, right? That's a safe haven, once again, for radical groups and entities. We still know that there are pockets of ISIS in places like Iraq and Syria. They've been a bit more dormant. I will tell you, very concerned about the fact that the Kurdish factions that arrested and incarcerated a number of, we're talking about probably hundreds of ISIS fighters. If there is chaos in Kurdistan and Syria, if some of these Turkish militias spring these ISIS fighters from jail, we could have a resurgence in Syria almost overnight. We still see pockets in Africa. It's generally, this has been this way for now more than a quarter of a century. It's areas of weak central authority are the ones that we need to worry about the most. The places where the state is weaker. They're not able to project authority outside of, let's say, a capital or, a major city. That the further out you get, the smaller amount of infrastructure, security infrastructure they have. So they're not able to collect as much intelligence. They're not as able to deploy forces to capture or to kill ISIS fighters or other jihadi fighters. But I think the last thing I would just note here is that it almost doesn't matter to me whether we're talking about a group called ISIS or we're talking about a group called Al-Qaeda or we're talking about a group called Hamas. None of these groups, it's a distinction without much of a difference when you start to think about the way in which groups like these will encourage their adherents to kill and to maim and to engage in attacks to dehumanize those that are not adherents to their faith or to their particular ideology. This was always the challenge that we had in the early years of the war on terror, but these labels that we put on them, they're almost interchangeable. It's not like you go around carrying a membership card for ISIS or Al-Qaeda, right? You believe in a certain way of thinking, and then therefore you are susceptible to the influence of some of these leaders, or those that are trying to mobilize a broader group of people.
That's a really interesting point. I want to dive a little deeper here because details are still emerging. As you and I know, the FBI now believes that this suspect acted alone. The suspect is a 42-year-old man, U.S.-born citizen from Texas who served in the Army. So when you hear those three facts about someone, you would wonder how they got radicalized. So how does someone get radicalized into believing this ISIS ideology and then carrying out this terror attack?
Yeah, look, we don't know exactly how this individual is radicalized. What we do know is, or at least we've seen reports, that the individual that carried out the attack, or that is believed to have carried out the attack in Las Vegas, may have actually served in the same Army base as the individual that carried out the attack in New Orleans. We're still getting information. Everything's been really fuzzy. It's been slow to come out. You get a sense that state and local police investigators are trying to be very careful with whatever information they have. But it's possible that these two incidents are connected. We're still waiting to find out whether this was the motivating factor for these two attacks, that maybe there was some kind of a broader cell that spans the country. That's a possibility. But I think, look, the bigger problem is the this interpretation of a faith that includes 1.5 billion people around the world. It is a minoritization of Islam that we're talking about here, but the numbers can still be large. If we're talking about 20% of the Muslim faith that buys into this ideology, just 20%, 1/5, right? That may be also very big, but even if that's the case, we're talking about a population that's roughly the size of the United States of America that would adhere to this kind of ideology. And so there would be ample material out there of people trying to promote these kinds of attacks. Again, it's really hard to know right now exactly what motivated these people, but we are getting a picture that it is Islamist ideology and ISIS ideology that is driving this. And it's impossible to purge all of that material from from the internet, from social media. It's out there. It's easy to consume. And then that doesn't even include what kind of ideological indoctrination may have taken place at a personal level, in ways that did not leave a digital footprint.
It's a really scary way to kick off the new year, seeing one terror incident, one possible terror incident within the hours of each other. Do you think that we can expect more terror incidents or copycats to be inspired by these types of attacks?
Look, my main concern right now is, again, that I think we could be seeing a return or a resurgence of Sunni jihadism. It was something that had trailed off. I think we were all under the impression, okay, God, we took care of that. Good, we're done with ISIS. They don't have a caliphate, as they call it. They don't control large chunks of territory. Bin Laden and Zawahiri were killed. Al Qaeda, that broader war that we were fighting in the Middle East, we had extricated ourselves finally. I think it was premature. We are now looking at essentially two countries that are controlled by Sunni jihadi terrorists, the Taliban and now Syria. And, there are a few other territories out there, including a country like Sudan, for example. That's another country that I'm watching very carefully and could succumb to this kind of radical ideology, radical leadership. So when you start to see that kind of infrastructure out there at the state level, not to mention those that have been funding these sorts of movements, wealthy deep pocket donors from the Persian Gulf, and you've got Pakistan that's been promoting this kind of radicalization around the Middle East, around the Muslim world. You've got countries like Indonesia and Malaysia that are susceptible to this radical ideology as well. We're just not out of the woods yet. And as long as that infrastructure is there, as long as there are governments that are susceptible, populations that are susceptible, will be susceptible here, because we don't close our borders. We allow people to live here from other countries. We're a melting pot, and it will include people that have been exposed to this ideology overseas or at home. So I'd say there's a decent chance that we'll see more of this. Now, the big question is whether we're at the beginning of a big wave, or whether these were one-off type of attacks. And I think, again, the most important question is whether our intelligence services have been tracking this all along. And there was a pivot at one point where I think our intelligence really began to focus on Chinese nationals that were trying to steal intellectual property or to set up cells here in the United States. So we have to kind of juggle a bunch of different threats that are going on right now. You've got the Chinese, you've got Russian operatives. We've actually jettisoned some Russian agents that were based here just a few years ago. And now on top of that, we've got the Sunni jihadi problem as well. So we're going to have to walk and chew gum. And it's going to be interesting to see here what kind of threat there is and how on top of it the FBI in particular has been.
I know you said you can basically sub out the names of ISIS and Hamas and other groups. They have very similar ideologies, but we haven't really heard ISIS in a while, as you said, and now you're curious. Have intelligence agencies been tracking this? What is your indication? I know it is early yet, it's within 24 hours of this attack, but is there a good indication that they have been following this? What does that look like?
Well, we know that, for example, heading into the New Year's Eve celebrations in New York, there was a pretty significant deployment of security personnel and intelligence. That's kind of par for the course in New York. They've got a significant security infrastructure, and they have for as long as I can recall. This is the center of commerce in the United States, and I think our largest city. So we saw deployments there. I don't know if we saw significant deployments in other cities. The indication that I saw is that the car that was used in that attack in New Orleans, that there was lax security. That perhaps even some of the more basic review of security might have prevented that car from being able to reach these people and could have averted a disaster. We just don't know how mobilized the FBI has been, whether the system was blinking red. There was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, early after 9/11, where the FBI, Homeland Security, would come out and issue statements to the American public, letting people know that they need to be vigilant, letting people know that the threat of a terrorist attack was something that was possible, and that folks needed to have their eyes open. If you see something, say something. I haven't seen much of that, if any at all, from the intelligence community here in the United States. So my sense is that, and it's always the case, that, our attention has shifted. We've been looking at other threats. My guess is that you have right now a bureau that is mobilizing as we speak, looking to ramp up efforts to make sure that this is not the beginning of a trend, and to do more to stop attacks. I mean, by the way, I should note, though, that even as these two attacks, or at least one appears to be clearly motivated by ISIS. The other one is, I guess, still being investigated in Las Vegas. But there was also, it appeared this was a successful thwarting on behalf of authorities in Florida. They stopped a man who was trying to carry out an attack against AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby organization. They were able to stop that, and that was, I think, good use of intelligence, successful thwarting of a terror attack. So we see some good news there, some less good news with some of these other incidents that took place over New Year's. I think a lot of questions right now still remain. In fact, I would say more questions than answers, because we're not getting a lot of information from authorities, not at the local level, not at the state level, certainly not at the federal level. I think the message that we're getting is that they're still trying to connect the dots, put the pieces together to come back with a story. Everyone's trying to be really careful to, not jump to conclusions about all of this. But what that means is that we're just getting a very slow trickle of information. And meanwhile, there could be other attacks looming, or perhaps, we'll dodge a bullet. But again, a lot out there we still don't know.
But what we do know is that Donald Trump will be in office in less than 3 weeks. And as you said at the beginning of this conversation, Trump faces a new challenging landscape once he gets back into the White House. So what do you think the response is going to be from the incoming Trump administration about all of these concerns that you have?
Well, look, I mean, you're going to have at some point soon a new FBI director. You're going to have a new secretary for Homeland Security. You're going to have new CIA leadership, new Department of Justice, right? I mean, you're going to Attorney General. You're going to have lots of new people coming in. They're going to have to get their feet under them. The thing that I'd really be interested to know is how much of the relevant information is going to be passed from the hands of the present leadership into the hands of those that are coming in, and to make sure that there is a seamless transition. I mean, famously, when George W. Bush's administration took over from the Clinton administration, there was not a lot of good discussion between the outgoing and incoming leaders, and as a result, it appears that that the Bush administration missed a lot of signs and the kind of intelligence that would have led to perhaps even stopping an attack like 9/11. So it's going to be important, despite the partisan rancor, despite the distrust between the two parties, between the two men, between the two administrations. There's going to have to be a sharing of that information. That's where the bureaucracy is going to be important, but also leaders that can transcend partisanship.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for when the Trump administration takes office. Also, a lot to look out for in this situation. It's evolving, as we know, and I hope you come back on for many conversations in 2025. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.